There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They knock on the door dressed in the plain clothes of a Tuesday evening, or a shared pizza, or the low murmur of a television documentary. You don't recognize them as architects of your future. You see only the mundane facade, unaware that inside, they are drafting the blueprints for a whole new version of you. For me, that moment wore the face of my best friend, Liam, asleep on my shoulder. It was not the first time it had happened, but it was the first time the sheer weight of it, both physical and metaphysical, threatened to anchor me to that spot forever. The world outside the worn corduroy of our sofa ceased to exist. There was only the lamplight casting a soft, honeyed glow on the room, the faint scent of his shampoo, something clean, like sandalwood and rain, and the almost imperceptible rhythm of his breathing against my neck. It was a pressure I had grown accustomed to, a warmth I had begun to crave with a silent, desperate ache. But on this night, something was different. A current had shifted deep beneath the surface of our friendship, and I felt the terrifying, exhilarating pull of a tide I knew I had no strength to fight. It was a simple equation, really. He was exhausted. I was still. He was a body seeking rest, and I was the nearest solid object. That was the logic I clung to, the neat, tidy explanation I presented to the anxious committee that convened nightly in my head. But logic is a fragile boat on the vast, unpredictable ocean of feeling. And as his head tilted further, his hair tickling the sensitive skin beneath my ear, I knew my little boat was taking on water. His hand, which had been resting limply on the cushion between us, twitched in his sleep and settled on my thigh. It was an unconscious gesture, a simple rearrangement of limbs in slumber, but it sent a jolt through my system so potent it was a miracle I didn't flinch and wake him. My entire consciousness collapsed into that single point of contact. The casual weight of his palm, the warmth seeping through the denim of my jeans, the slight indentation his fingers made. It was a brand, a claim. In that moment, under the false pretenses of sleep and exhaustion, a line was not so much crossed as it was completely erased, and the vast, uncharted territory on the other side was both terrifying and beautiful to behold. I held my breath, a statue carved from hope and fear, and I did not move. I couldn't. I was no longer just a fixed point for him to rest against. I was an active participant in a silent, fragile conspiracy of closeness. To understand the tectonic significance of that touch, you have to understand the geology of our friendship. Liam and I had met in the chaotic scrum of university housing assignments, two names randomly paired by an algorithm that, in its cold, binary heart, had accidentally stumbled upon a perfect match. He was studying software engineering, his mind a place of elegant logic and structured code. I was studying photography, my world a chaotic mess of light and shadow, of capturing fleeting, unstructured moments. On the surface, we were a study in contrasts. He was the sun, bright and effortlessly warm, drawing people into his orbit with an easy laugh and a genuine interest in their lives. I was the moon, quieter, more reflective, content to exist in the gentle light he cast. He filled our tiny dorm room with the sounds of his expanding social life, friends dropping by, plans being made, the constant ping of his phone. I filled it with the quiet scratch of a pencil on a sketch pad and the chemical scent of developing fluid from the campus darkroom. Yet, beneath the surface differences, we found an immediate and unnerving similarity. We were both observers. Liam observed systems, code, and the intricate dance of social dynamics, finding patterns and optimizing them. I observed light, emotion, and the way a person's entire history could be held in the slight downturn of their mouth. We talked for hours in those early days, sprawled on our respective twin beds, the darkness of the room broken only by the glow of a laptop screen or the orange streetlights filtering through the window. We talked about everything and nothing, the frustrating labyrinth of our coursework, the questionable quality of the dining hall food, the futures we cautiously hoped for. He spoke of building things, of creating systems that would make people's lives easier, more connected. I spoke of capturing things, of preserving moments that would otherwise be lost to the relentless current of time. He was an architect of the future. I was a curator of the past. Our friendship solidified into something that felt less like a choice and more like a fundamental law of our shared universe. It was built on a foundation of mutual respect and an unspoken understanding that we provided something for each other that the rest of the world did not. For him, I think I was a place of quiet. His life, even then, was a whirlwind of expectations, deadlines, and social obligations. With me, there was no need for performance. We could sit in comfortable silence for hours, him debugging a program, me editing photos, and the space between us would be filled not with awkwardness, but with a sense of profound peace. For me, he was an anchor. My artistic temperament often left me adrift in a sea of self-doubt and existential anxiety. Liam, with his unshakable pragmatism and his genuine belief in my talent, was the shoreline I could always swim back to. He was the one who would look at 100 of my photos, his brow furrowed in concentration, and point to the one that was not just technically proficient, but emotionally true. That one, he'd say, with a certainty that quieted all my inner critics. That's the one. When we graduated, the decision to get an apartment together was so obvious it was never even a formal discussion. It was simply the next logical step in the progression of our lives, like breathing or sleeping. We found a place on the 3rd floor of an old brick building with high ceilings and drafty windows, a space that felt like a natural extension of our dorm room, only bigger, with more room for our separate lives to coexist. He took a job as a consultant for a tech firm, a role that sent him flying across the country at a moment's notice. I began the slow, arduous process of building a freelance photography career, turning our spare bedroom into a makeshift studio and office. Our lives fell into a rhythm dictated by his travel schedule and my deadlines. There were weeks when we were just 2 ships passing in the night, communicating through sticky notes left on the refrigerator. "Ate the last of the milk, sorry," he'd write. "Your new prints look amazing," I'd leave in return. And then there were the weeks when he was home. Those were the weeks that sustained me. The apartment would feel full again, charged with his energy. The quiet hum of the refrigerator would be replaced by the sound of his keyboard, the smell of coffee he'd brewed, the low rumble of his voice on a conference call. It was during these periods of domestic stillness that the delicate, platonic lines of our friendship began to feel, to me at least, dangerously thin. It was in the small, unconscious intimacies of sharing a space. The way he'd walk into the kitchen while I was making dinner and steal a piece of chopped bell pepper, his fingers brushing mine. The way I'd fold his laundry, left for days in the dryer, and feel a strange, proprietary warmth in the fabric of his t-shirts. The way we'd end up on the sofa at the end of a long day, the television a distant noise, our shoulders occasionally brushing as one of us shifted. For my part, I had been harboring a secret for years, a feeling that had taken root sometime in the dim light of our shared dorm room and had since grown into a quiet, sprawling forest inside me. It was a love that asked for nothing. It was patient and observant, content to exist in the spaces he didn't occupy, to live off the ambient light of his presence. I had built a fortress around it, a carefully constructed edifice of plausible deniability. He was my best friend. He was, as far as I knew and as we had both always identified, straight. These were the foundational truths upon which I had built my life, and to question them felt like inviting an earthquake. So I learned to live with the quiet ache, the low-frequency hum of longing that was the constant soundtrack to my days. I channeled it into my work. My best photographs were, in a way, all portraits of him, even when he wasn't in the frame. They were about the way the light fell in the living room after he'd left for a trip, the profound emptiness of his favorite armchair, the stark geometry of his side of the bedroom, neat and orderly, a reflection of the beautiful logic of his mind. My love for him was a secret language I spoke only to myself, a religion with a congregation of one. I was the keeper of a sacred, painful flame, and my primary duty was to ensure it never caught the whole house on fire. The catalyst for the great shift, when it came, was not a dramatic explosion but a slow, quiet erosion. It was his breakup with Sarah. She was a girl he'd met at a conference in Chicago, smart and ambitious, a mirror of his own drive. Their relationship had been a thing of airports and late-night video calls, a romance conducted across time zones. From my vantage point, it had always seemed more like a logistical challenge than a love affair. I would hear his side of their conversations, his voice tight with the frustration of a bad connection or a delayed flight. He seemed to be constantly apologizing for his schedule, for his exhaustion, for the miles that separated them. I, of course, said all the right things. I asked how she was. I told him I was happy for him when he seemed happy. But privately, I saw their relationship as a complex piece of code that was fundamentally flawed, full of bugs that would inevitably cause the whole system to crash. The crash came on a rainy Tuesday in October. He had just gotten back from a 2-week stint in Seattle, and the exhaustion clung to him like a shroud. He dropped his bags by the door and collapsed onto the sofa without even taking off his jacket. I was in the kitchen, and I heard the muted, tense tones of his voice on the phone. I couldn't make out the words, only the rhythm of the conversation, long, pained silences punctuated by his low, defeated responses. Then, the final, dreadful quiet. He was silent for so long that I finally came out of the kitchen, wiping my hands on a dish towel. He was sitting exactly as I'd left him, but his head was in his hands, his shoulders slumped. The posture of utter defeat. "Liam?" I asked, my voice softer than I intended. He looked up, and I saw something in his eyes I had never seen before, a complete and total absence of his usual light. They were dull, hollowed out. It was like looking at a city during a power failure. "It's over," he said, his voice a rough, broken thing. "With Sarah. It's done." I didn't know what to do. The triumphant, selfish part of me, the part that had been secretly hoping for this, was immediately silenced by the raw, undeniable reality of his pain. This wasn't a flawed system crashing. This was a person breaking. I crossed the room and sat on the coffee table in front of him, a clumsy gesture of support. I put a hand on his knee. "I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it. I was sorry that he was hurting. I was sorry that the world had conspired to extinguish his light. He didn't pull away. He just nodded, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the rain-streaked window. "It was inevitable," he mumbled. "You can't build a life over FaceTime. It's just data. It's not real." He finally looked at me, his eyes searching mine for something. "I'm so tired, Ethan. Just so tired of trying to connect through a screen." That was the beginning. It was the moment the ground became unstable. His loneliness, once a theoretical concept buffered by a long-distance relationship, was now a palpable presence in our apartment. It sat with us at the dinner table. It filled the silence when the television was off. And his exhaustion, once just a side effect of his job, became a chronic condition. He was a ship that had been battered by a storm, and he was drifting, looking for a safe harbor. And the only harbor in sight was me. The ritual began subtly, as most rituals do. It started with movie nights. We had always had them, but now they took on a new urgency. They were no longer a casual way to pass an evening. They were a necessary part of his decompression process after a trip. He would come home, drop his bags, take a long shower, and emerge in sweatpants and a soft t-shirt, his hair still damp. He'd have that same hollowed-out look in his eyes, the look of a man running on fumes. "Movie?" he'd ask, and it wasn't really a question. It was a plea. I would agree, of course. I'd make popcorn. I'd dim the lights. We would settle onto the sofa, our usual buffer zone of a cushion or two between us. But as the movie played, as the exhaustion of the day or the week began to claim him, the space would slowly collapse. It would start with his head leaning against the back of the sofa. Then, a slight tilt, his hair brushing the fabric of my hoodie. And then, finally, the gentle, boneless surrender as his head came to rest on my shoulder. The first time it happened, my entire body went rigid. I was acutely aware of every point of contact. The weight of his head, surprisingly heavy. The warmth of his scalp through the thin fabric of my shirt. The soft puff of his breath against my collarbone. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the slow, steady rhythm of his own breathing. I was terrified he would wake up, realize what he was doing, and recoil in embarrassment or confusion. I was terrified I would do something to give myself away, a shift in my posture, a hitch in my breath. I sat there for the entire 2-hour duration of the film, my muscles screaming in protest, my mind a whirlwind of panic and a strange, illicit joy. When the credits rolled, I gently nudged him. He stirred, blinked, and sat up, rubbing his eyes. "Oh man," he mumbled. "Sorry. I must have conked out." He showed no sign of awkwardness, no awareness that a boundary had been crossed. For him, it was nothing. It was sleep. For me, it was everything. That first time became the template. The next time he was home, the same sequence played out. The weary request for a movie, the settling onto the sofa, and the slow, inevitable drift into sleep against my shoulder. Only this time, I didn't go rigid. My body, remembering the pattern, braced for the contact, and then something miraculous happened. It relaxed into it. I learned to accommodate his weight, to angle my shoulder just so, to let my own head rest against his. I was learning the language of this new intimacy, and it was a language spoken not with words, but with weight and warmth and stillness. Each time it happened, my internal monologue was a chaotic symphony of analysis and justification. The logical part of my brain, the part that sounded a lot like Liam, insisted on the simplest explanation. He was a tired man seeking comfort, and I was a convenient, non-threatening source of it. I was a friend. I was safe. I was, in essence, a piece of furniture, a particularly comfortable, human-shaped pillow. This explanation was my shield. It allowed me to participate in the ritual without having to confront the terrifying implications. It allowed me to enjoy the profound, illicit pleasure of his closeness without being consumed by the hope that it meant more. But the other part of my brain, the photographer's eye, the part that saw the world in shades of nuance and unspoken emotion, saw something else entirely. It saw the choice in the act. Our sofa was large. He could have leaned against the armrest. He could have curled up on the other end. He could have, and on some level should have, maintained the respectable, platonic distance we had always observed. But he didn't. Night after night, he chose, consciously or not, to bridge that gap. He chose my shoulder. And that choice, however unconscious, felt significant. It felt like a confession. He was confessing his loneliness, his exhaustion, his need for a connection that wasn't mediated by a screen or 1,000 miles of fiber optic cable. He was confessing a need for something real. The ritual escalated, as rituals tend to do when they are fulfilling a deep, unspoken need. The space between us on the sofa disappeared entirely. We would start movies sitting side by side, our thighs already touching. The journey to my shoulder became shorter, more direct. Sometimes he wouldn't even wait for sleep to claim him. He would just sigh, a long, weary exhalation that seemed to carry the weight of his entire week, and rest his head against me, his eyes still open, watching the screen. In those moments, I would feel a powerful, protective urge wash over me. I wanted to build a fortress around us, to keep the demanding, exhausting world at bay. I wanted to keep him safe in this quiet, lamplit space. Then came the night of the hand. We were a few weeks into this new, fragile routine. He had just returned from a particularly brutal trip to Boston, a project that had gone sideways and required him to work 18-hour days. The hollows under his eyes were deeper than I'd ever seen them. He looked brittle, as if a strong wind could shatter him. He barely spoke when he got home, just gave me a weak, grateful smile when I handed him a plate of food. We settled on the couch, and he was asleep within minutes, his head heavy on my shoulder. I was watching the movie, my mind half on the plot and half on the familiar, comforting weight of him, when I felt the shift. His hand, which had been resting on the cushion, moved. It was a slow, sleepy motion, an act of unconscious seeking. It brushed against my leg, and then, instead of pulling back, it just stayed. His palms settled flat on my thigh, his fingers curled loosely against the denim. My breath caught in my throat. This was new. This was different. A head on a shoulder could be explained away by gravity and exhaustion. A hand, resting with such deliberate, possessive stillness, was a different grammar altogether. It spoke of trust. It spoke of comfort. And in the wild, hopeful corners of my mind, it spoke of a deeper, unspoken claim. My skin burned where he was touching me. I could feel the individual heat of each of his fingers through the fabric of my jeans. I could feel the faint, steady pulse in his wrist against my leg. The entire world, the movie, the apartment, the city outside, all of it dissolved into the single, overwhelming reality of his touch. I was terrified. I was elated. I felt like an archivist who had stumbled upon a lost, sacred text. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe, for fear of breaking the spell. I just sat there, pinned in place by 5 fingers and the weight of 1,000 unspoken possibilities. I looked down at his hand on my leg, the way the soft lamplight caught the lines on his knuckles, and I knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and liberating, that my neat, tidy explanations were no longer sufficient. The boat of logic had not just taken on water. It had capsized and sunk, leaving me floating in a vast, deep, and uncharted sea. This new stage of the ritual, the inclusion of his hand on my leg, became a regular feature of our evenings. It was a silent punctuation mark at the end of his long, weary weeks. The initial shock I felt gave way to a kind of reverent anticipation. As we'd settle on the sofa, I'd find myself waiting for it, for that moment of surrender when he would not only rest his head on my shoulder, but also seek the anchor of that physical touch. My body learned to welcome it, to accept the warmth as a natural part of our shared silence. I began to see it as a form of communication, a more honest one than words could ever be. His hand on my leg said, "I am here. I am tired. I am safe with you." And my stillness in response said, "I know. I will not move. I will hold this space for you." I lived a double life in those months. Outwardly, I was the steady, reliable friend, the calm center in his chaotic world. I was the roommate who made sure there was food in the fridge when he got home, who listened patiently as he vented about his clients, who offered the simple, uncomplicated comfort of a movie night. But inwardly, I was a landscape of seismic activity. Every casual touch, every shared silence, was a tremor along a fault line I had spent years pretending did not exist. I was a detective, gathering clues, analyzing evidence, trying to build a case for a truth I desperately wanted to believe, that this was not just about his loneliness, but about ours. That the comfort he sought was not just any comfort, but my comfort. My photography became my confessional. I couldn't speak these feelings aloud, couldn't risk shattering the fragile ecosystem of our home, so I poured them onto photographic paper. I started a new series, a secret project I worked on late at night after he had gone to bed. It was a series of self-portraits, but my face was never the subject. The focus was on the spaces he had just occupied. A photograph of my shoulder, the fabric of the t-shirt still creased from the weight of his head. A photograph of my thigh, the denim still holding the faint impression of his hand. A photograph of the empty sofa, the cushions indented with the shape of our bodies, 2 hollows side by side, impossibly close. It was an attempt to capture the ghost of his presence, the tangible evidence of our intangible connection. The images were quiet, melancholic, and filled with a yearning so profound it was almost painful to look at them. They were the truest things I had ever created. The tension reached its apex on a cold night in early December. A snowstorm had blanketed the city, canceling flights and shutting down roads. Liam had been scheduled to fly to Denver that afternoon, but by noon, it was clear no one was going anywhere. There was a strange, festive energy to being snowed in. The world outside went silent, muffled by the falling snow, and our apartment felt like a self-contained snow globe, a perfect, isolated world. We ordered pizza, drank the cheap red wine we always kept on hand, and settled in for a marathon of old movies. There was a different quality to his energy that night. He wasn't collapsing from the bone-deep weariness of travel. He was just relaxed. The cancellation of his flight felt less like an inconvenience and more like a reprieve, a hall pass from his demanding life. He was laughing more, his real laugh, the one that started deep in his chest. He told me stories from his project in Boston, imitating his ridiculous clients, and I found myself laughing so hard my sides ached. The space between us on the sofa felt charged, not with the usual melancholic comfort, but with a vibrant, joyful energy. As the night wore on and the wine took hold, the easy intimacy that had been cultivated over months of our ritual began to express itself in new ways. He didn't just fall asleep on me. Instead, as we started the third movie, he just shifted, turned, and curled up against my side, tucking his feet up on the sofa. He rested his head not on my shoulder, but in the hollow of my chest, his arm draped casually across my stomach. My arm, as if with a mind of its own, came to rest around his shoulders, my hand settling on the back of his neck. His hair was soft beneath my fingers. I could feel the slow, steady beat of his heart against my ribs, a counterpoint to the frantic rhythm of my own. We lay like that for a long time, the movie playing to an audience of two people who were not watching it. My mind, for once, was not a chaotic storm of analysis. It was quiet. It was still. The constant hum of my secret longing had been replaced by the overwhelming, deafening roar of its potential fulfillment. This was not about exhaustion. This was not about comfort. This felt like a choice, a deliberate, conscious act of closeness. I could feel the warmth of his breath through my t-shirt. I could smell the wine on his breath, mixed with the familiar, clean scent of his shampoo. I ran my thumb slowly, almost imperceptibly, over the warm skin of his neck, a tiny, terrifying gesture of affection. He didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. If anything, he seemed to press closer, a soft, contented sigh escaping his lips. The movie ended. The credits rolled, casting a flickering white light across the dark room. The silence that followed was profound. It was not empty. It was filled with everything we had never said, with the entire history of our friendship, with the weight of this single, transformative night. I was acutely aware that this was a crossroads. The plausible deniability was gone. We were no longer just friends cuddling on a couch. We were two people tangled up together in the dark, on the brink of something unknown. He stirred against my chest, not pulling away, but shifting his head so he could look up at me. His eyes, in the dim light, were dark and unreadable. The easy humor of the evening was gone, replaced by something more serious, more vulnerable. My heart felt like it was going to beat its way out of my chest. This was it. This was the moment the silence would break. "Ethan," he whispered, his voice thick with sleep and wine. "Yeah." I whispered back, my own voice barely audible. He just looked at me for a long moment, his gaze searching my face as if he were trying to read the answer to a question he hadn't yet asked. The air between us was electric, thick with a tension that was almost unbearable. I could see the slight tremor in his hand where it rested on my stomach. He was nervous. He was as terrified as I was. Then, he spoke again, his voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it. "Would it be okay?" he started, and then he hesitated, swallowing hard. "Would it be okay if I kissed you?" The question hung in the air between us, a fragile, shimmering thing. It was not a proposition. It was not a demand. It was a plea for permission. It was an admission of vulnerability so profound it took my breath away. All my carefully constructed fortresses, all my shields of logic and denial, crumbled to dust in the face of that one, simple, terrifying question. He was not the unknowing initiator anymore. He knew. He was asking. And in that moment, he was giving me all the power. I could say no. I could retreat to the safety of our friendship, pretend this night never happened, and we could go on as we were. Or I could say yes, and step off the cliff with him into the beautiful, terrifying unknown. I didn't trust my voice to work, so I just nodded, a small, jerky movement. It felt inadequate to convey the tidal wave of emotion crashing through me, the relief, the terror, the overwhelming, soaring joy. It was enough. He slowly, tentatively, pushed himself up, his hand sliding from my stomach to my chest, resting over my frantic heart. He leaned in, and the space between us, which had been charged with unspoken tension, was now filled with a sense of sacred reverence. His lips met mine, and it was not a passionate, fiery kiss like in the movies. It was soft. It was hesitant. It was a question, a confirmation, a confession. It tasted of cheap red wine and years of unspoken affection. It was the gentlest collision, a feather-light touch that sent a seismic shock through my entire being. It was the sound of a door, locked and barred for years, finally, quietly, clicking open. We stayed like that for only a moment, but it contained a lifetime. When he pulled back, he rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed. We just breathed, sharing the same air, our hearts beating a frantic, synchronized rhythm. The silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was not the silence of things unsaid. It was the silence of things finally, blessedly, understood. The aftermath of a storm is often quieter than the storm itself. The world holds its breath, assessing the damage, taking stock of what has been rearranged. The morning after the kiss was like that. I woke up first, still on the sofa. I was alone. A blanket had been draped over me, and a pillow tucked under my head. Liam's side of the couch was empty, the cushion cool to the touch. For a dizzying, panicked moment, I wondered if I had dreamed it all, if the wine and the snow and my own desperate longing had conspired to create a perfect, heartbreaking hallucination. But then I saw his wine glass still on the coffee table, next to mine, and the memory of his question, of his soft, hesitant lips, came rushing back with an undeniable clarity. I found him in the kitchen, staring out the window at the snow-covered street, a mug of coffee cradled in his hands. He was already dressed in jeans and a sweater, a stark contrast to the comfortable intimacy of the night before. He looked like he was building his walls back up, brick by painful brick. The easy, relaxed energy was gone, replaced by a tense, guarded stillness that made my stomach clench with anxiety. "Hey," I said, my voice rough with sleep. He jumped, startled, and turned to face me. He couldn't quite meet my eyes. "Morning," he mumbled, his gaze fixed on the handle of his coffee mug. I made coffee. The air in the kitchen was thick with a new, terrible kind of awkwardness. The comfortable silence we had always shared was gone, replaced by a chasm of unspoken fear. The beautiful, honest silence of the night before had curdled into something sour and anxious. I poured myself a mug of coffee, my movements feeling clumsy and loud in the quiet room. I leaned against the counter opposite him, mirroring his posture, creating a physical representation of the distance that had suddenly opened up between us. "Liam," I started, wanting to break the tension, wanting to get back to the feeling of his forehead against mine, of our shared breath in the dark. "About last night. I was drunk," he cut in, his voice flat. He finally looked at me, but his eyes were shuttered, defensive. "We were drunk. The snow, it was a weird night. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have, it was a mistake." Each word was a physical blow. A mistake. Drunk. Sorry. He was dismantling the beautiful, fragile thing we had built, piece by piece, and replacing it with the cold, hard framework of regret. The hope that had soared so high in my chest plummeted, leaving a cold, heavy emptiness in its wake. I felt a flush of anger, hot and sharp, beneath the hurt. He wasn't just rejecting the kiss. He was rejecting me. He was invalidating everything. The months of couch rituals, the hand on my leg, the quiet confessions of his loneliness. He was trying to rewrite the entire narrative, to file it away under anomalous data point, a mistake. I repeated, my voice colder than I intended. "Is that what it was? You asked me if you can kiss me," a question that I'm pretty sure required a fair amount of sober thought, and now you're telling me it was a drunken mistake. "It was confusing," he said, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of pure frustration. He started pacing the small kitchen, a caged animal. "I've been going through a lot. The breakup, the job. I'm all over the place. I leaned on you, I know that. And last night, I crossed a line. It wasn't fair to you. We're friends. We're roommates. I messed that up." He was using the language of logic, of systems and boundaries, to explain away an event that had been purely emotional. He was trying to debug our friendship, to roll it back to a previous, stable version. But he wasn't seeing the most crucial part. I hadn't experienced it as a bug. I had experienced it as the program's true and intended function. The anger drained out of me, replaced by a profound, aching sadness. He didn't see it. He couldn't, or wouldn't, see it. "So you're just going to pretend it didn't mean anything?" I asked, my voice quiet now, laced with a hurt I couldn't hide. It meant we were drunk and lonely and snowed in, he snapped, his voice rising with a desperation that bordered on panic. It doesn't have to mean anything else, Ethan. Why are you trying to make it mean something else? Because it meant everything to me. The words were on the tip of my tongue, a confession that would burn down the last remaining structures of our friendship. But looking at his panicked face, at the genuine terror in his eyes, I couldn't say them. It would be like throwing a lit match into a room filled with gas fumes. He wasn't ready. He was retreating so fast and so hard that any attempt to follow him would only make him run further. So I did the only thing I could do. I lied. I protected him. I protected what was left of us. You're right, I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. You're right. It was a weird night. Let's just forget it. The relief that flooded his face was instantaneous and devastating. It was the look of a man who had just narrowly avoided a fatal crash. He stopped pacing and gave me a weak, grateful smile that broke my heart all over again. Right, he said, nodding. Yeah, forget it. We're good, but we weren't good. We were broken. And the silence that fell between us then was the worst silence of all. It was the silence of a lie, a shared, unspoken agreement to pretend that the most honest moment we had ever shared had never happened at all. The days that followed were a masterclass in avoidance. The easy intimacy of our apartment was replaced by a carefully choreographed dance of distance. The open door to his bedroom was now perpetually closed. He started wearing headphones around the apartment, creating a portable bubble of sound that I could not penetrate. Our conversations dwindled to logistical necessities. I'm ordering takeout. Want anything? I'll be working late tonight. The couch, once our shared sanctuary, became a desolate, empty space. We no longer had movie nights. The ritual was dead, and its ghost haunted the living room. I watched him retreat, and it was like watching a slow-motion demolition. He was throwing himself into his work with a frantic, desperate energy, taking on extra projects, extending his trips. He was running from the memory of that night, from the confusion it had stirred up in him. He was running from me. And with every closed door, with every clipped, one-word answer, he was reinforcing the narrative he had created. It was a mistake, a meaningless anomaly. My own heart was a ruin. The hope that had been so violently ignited had been just as violently extinguished, leaving behind a landscape of scorched earth. I felt foolish. I felt naive. I had mistaken his desperate need for comfort for a dawning affection. I had built a cathedral of meaning out of a foundation of sand. The hurt was a constant, physical presence, a weight in my chest that made it difficult to breathe. I tried to pour it into my work, but even my camera felt like a betrayal. The secret project I had been working on, the photos of our shared spaces, now seemed like evidence of my own delusion. I packed the prints away in a box and pushed it to the back of my closet. This cold war of polite avoidance went on for nearly 2 weeks. 2 weeks of living with a ghost, of sharing a space with a stranger who looked just like my best friend. The silence in the apartment was deafening. It was a silence full of unspoken accusations, of regret, of a profound and painful misunderstanding. I was drowning in it, and I realized that as painful as the truth might be, it was better than this slow, quiet death. I couldn't live in the wreckage of his denial anymore. I had to know. I had to force the issue, even if it meant losing him completely. The fragile piece of our lie was more unbearable than the potential chaos of the truth. I waited for him to come home from a short trip to Philadelphia. I heard his keys in the lock, the familiar sound of his bags dropping by the door. I was sitting on the sofa, the same sofa where it had all happened, waiting for him. I had rehearsed what I was going to say 100 times, but now, with him standing in the hallway, his shoulders slumped with a weariness that seemed more emotional than physical, all my carefully prepared words evaporated. He saw me and froze. "Hey," he said, his voice cautious. "Didn't expect you to be up. We need to talk, Liam," I said, my voice shaking slightly despite my resolve. "I can't do this anymore. This silence. This pretending." A look of panic flashed in his eyes. He started to make an excuse. "Look, Ethan, I'm really tired. Can we?" "No." I cut him off, my voice firmer now. "We can't. We're going to talk about this now. Because if we don't, There's not going to be anything left to save. I gestured to the armchair opposite the sofa. Please, just sit. He hesitated for a long moment, his internal battle playing out on his face. Then, with a sigh of resignation, he walked into the room and sank into the armchair. He didn't look at me. He stared at his hands, twisting them in his lap. I took a deep breath, the air in the room feeling thick and heavy. You said the kiss was a mistake. I began, my voice quiet but clear. You said you were drunk and confused. And I let you say it, because I could see how scared you were. But I don't believe you. I can't believe you. I leaned forward, my elbows on my knees, trying to will him to look at me. For months, Liam, you have been coming to me for something. For comfort. For rest. You fell asleep on my shoulder night after night. You put your hand on my leg. You curled up against my chest. Were those all drunken mistakes, too? Was it all just about you being lonely and me being the closest warm body? Because if that's all it was, if I was just a convenience for you, a human pillow to get you through a rough patch, you need to tell me that. You need to look me in the eye and tell me that it meant nothing. Because I deserve to know if I've been a complete and utter fool. The silence stretched on, taut and agonizing. He still wouldn't look at me. I could see his jaw working, his throat moving as he swallowed hard. I had laid all my cards on the table. I had admitted how much it meant to me, how much I had read into his actions. I had made myself completely and utterly vulnerable. The next move was his. When he finally spoke, his voice was a ragged whisper, broken and raw. I can't, he said. You can't what? I pressed, my heart hammering. You can't tell me it meant nothing? He shook his head, a small, miserable motion. He finally lifted his head and looked at me, and his eyes were swimming with unshed tears. The sight of it, of my strong, pragmatic, logical Liam on the verge of tears, shattered the last of my anger. I can't tell you it meant nothing, he whispered. Because it didn't. It's the only thing that's felt real in months. The confession, when it came, was not a triumphant explosion. It was a quiet, painful surrender. It was the sound of his own walls, so hastily rebuilt, finally coming down. Then why? I asked, my own voice thick with emotion. Why did you push me away? Why did you say it was a mistake? Because I was terrified, he said, a single tear tracing a path down his cheek. He didn't bother to wipe it away. Ethan, my whole life, it's been a straight line. College, job, girlfriend. It's a path. It's logical. It makes sense. And you? This, it doesn't fit. It's not on the map. And the moment I kissed you, the moment you kissed me back, it was like the ground fell away. It was wonderful, and it was the most terrifying thing that has ever happened to me. He took a shaky breath, his gaze pleading with me to understand. I don't know what this is. I don't know what it means. I've never felt this way about a guy, about a friend. And all I could think was that I was going to ruin everything. Our friendship, our home. You're the most important person in my life, Ethan. You're my anchor. And I felt like I was about to drag you down into this confusion with me. So I panicked. I tried to put it back in the box. I tried to pretend it didn't happen. I hurt you. I know I did. And I am so sorry. His confession was a floodgate opening. All his fear and confusion and affection pouring out in a torrent of honest, painful words. He wasn't rejecting me. He was terrified of his own feelings, of what they meant for his identity, for the life he thought he was supposed to live. He had pushed me away not because he didn't care, but because he cared too much. The understanding settled over me, a profound and gentle wave, washing away all the hurt and anger, leaving only a deep, powerful empathy in its place. I got up from the sofa and crossed the small space between us. I knelt on the floor in front of his armchair, so we were at eye level. I reached out and, tentatively, took his hands. They were cold and trembling. You don't have to have it all figured out, I said softly. You don't need a map. We can just be in this. Together. We can be confused together. Isn't that better than being lonely apart? He looked at our joined hands, then back up at my face. A small, watery smile touched his lips. You're always the calm one, he whispered. Only on the outside, I admitted, squeezing his hands. On the inside. I've been a Category 5 hurricane for about 5 years. He let out a choked laugh, a sound that was half sob, half relief. He tightened his grip on my hands. "Okay," he said, his voice stronger now. "Okay." Together, it wasn't a perfect storybook ending. It was a beginning. A messy, complicated, and breathtakingly honest one. We didn't have a map. We didn't know where we were going. But for the first time, we had admitted we were on the same journey. And as I knelt there on the floor, holding the hands of my best friend, I felt a sense of peace settle over me, a quiet certainty that, whatever came next, we would face it together. The silence in the room was no longer a weapon or a shield. It was just a space, waiting to be filled with a new kind of language, one we would have to learn to speak together. The conversation that night did not magically solve everything. It was not an incantation that instantly transformed us into a perfect, fully formed couple. Instead, it was more like signing a peace treaty after a long, cold war. It was an agreement to stop fighting, to lay down our arms, his denial, my hurt, and to begin the slow, difficult work of rebuilding. The days that followed were tentative, fragile things. We were like two people learning to walk again after a long illness, unsure of our footing, testing our balance. We started with small, deliberate acts of reconnection. The closed bedroom door was the first casualty of our new truce. He started leaving it open again, a simple gesture that felt monumental. It was an invitation back into his space, a signal that he was no longer hiding. I would walk past and see him at his desk, and he would look up and offer a small, shy smile, and I would smile back. It was a silent acknowledgement, a daily reaffirmation of the choice we had made. The headphones disappeared. The silence in the apartment began to fill up again, not with the deafening roar of things unsaid, but with the gentle, mundane sounds of a shared life. The click of his keyboard, the whisper of pages turning as I looked through a photography book, the shared laughter over a stupid online video. We were rediscovering the comfortable rhythm of our coexistence, but this time, it was underscored by a new, thrilling awareness. The sofa remained a kind of neutral territory for a few days, a monument to both our greatest intimacy and our greatest conflict. We would sit on it, a careful, respectful distance between us, as if it were still loaded with emotional landmines. We were circling back to the beginning, rebuilding the foundation of our friendship before we could dare to build anything on top of it. We talked. We really talked, not just about logistics or work, but about the things we had been too afraid to say. He told me more about the fear, about the feeling of his carefully constructed world tilting on its axis. He admitted that his feelings for me hadn't sprung out of nowhere on that snowy night, but had been a low, confusing hum beneath the surface for a long time, a hum he had tried to ignore, to rationalize away as just part of a close friendship. I, in turn, began to dismantle my own fortress. I confessed the full extent of my feelings, the years of quiet, patient love I had harbored for him. I told him about the photographs, about how he was the secret subject of all my best work. One evening, my heart pounding with a familiar, vulnerable rhythm, I pulled the box of prints from my closet and showed them to him. He sat on the floor, spreading them out on the rug, his expression one of quiet awe. He looked at the photo of my empty shoulder, the creased fabric a ghost of his presence. He looked at the photo of the indented cushions on the sofa. He looked at them for a long time, in silence. "This is how you see things?" he asked finally, his voice full of wonder. He picked up the photo of my thigh, the faint impression of his hand a ghostly presence on the denim. "I never knew," he whispered. "I never knew I was leaving a mark." "You were?" I said softly. "You always were." That was a turning point. Seeing his unconscious actions reflected back at him through my eyes seemed to solidify something for him. It made the intangible tangible. It was evidence, data he could understand, that our connection was not just in his head or mine, but was a real, physical force that had been shaping our shared space for years. A few nights later, we were on the sofa, watching a movie. The familiar, careful distance was between us. The air was still a little bit tentative. About halfway through the film, he sighed, a sound I knew well. It was the sigh of a long day, of a mind finally letting go. But instead of leaning against me, he just looked at me. His eyes were clear, his expression open and questioning. Is it still okay?" he asked, his voice quiet. He didn't need to specify what he meant. My heart did a slow, joyful flip in my chest. This was different. This was not the unconscious seeking of an exhausted man. This was not the wine-fueled bravery of a snowed-in night. This was a conscious choice, a deliberate request, made in the clear, sober light of our new understanding. I didn't answer with words. I just held out my arm, an invitation. He smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes and lit them from within. He shifted closer, bridging the gap between us, and rested his head on my shoulder. It felt both familiar and brand new. The weight was the same, the warmth was the same, but the meaning was entirely different. There was no anxiety, no frantic internal analysis on my part. There was no plausible deniability on his. It was not a secret. It was not a mistake. It was a statement. This is where I belong. My arm came around him, my hand resting on his arm this time. A simple, grounding touch. He settled against me with a contented sigh, and a few moments later, his hand came to rest on my leg, just as it had done so many times before. But this time, his fingers gently, deliberately, intertwined with mine. It was a small gesture, but it was everything. It was the final piece of the puzzle clicking into place. We sat there, our hands clasped together, and watched the rest of the movie. It was the most normal, extraordinary thing in the world. Our new normal was built on these small, intentional moments. It was in the way he would now seek out my hand when we walked down the street, his touch no longer hesitant but confident and sure. It was in the way I would wake up in the morning to find he had made me a cup of coffee, leaving it on my nightstand. It was in the quiet domesticity of cooking dinner together, our bodies brushing past each other in the small kitchen, the contact no longer accidental but welcome. We were learning a new kind of intimacy, one that was spoken in the language of gentle gestures and quiet care. The physical space of our apartment began to reflect the change in our relationship. The invisible line dividing his side from my side began to blur. My camera equipment found its way onto his shelves. His programming books ended up on my desk. One night, after a long evening that had ended with us falling asleep tangled together on the sofa, I woke up with a crick in my neck. "This couch is going to be the death of us," I mumbled, stretching. Liam, still half asleep, his hair a mess, just looked at me. "My bed's bigger," he said, as if it were the most obvious solution in the world. And just like that, another wall came down. That night, I followed him to his room, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Sleeping next to him, without the pretext of exhaustion or a movie, was a revelation. It was the profound peace of knowing that this person, this solid, warm, breathing presence next to me in the dark, was my safe harbor. It was the simple, unspoken joy of waking up next to the person you love. Our story did not have a grand, cinematic climax. It was a quiet unfolding, a slow, gentle healing. The love that I had kept hidden for so long was finally allowed out into the light, and I discovered it was not a destructive fire, but a gentle, steady warmth, one that he, in his own time, had learned to turn towards. He was still the pragmatic, logical man I had always known, but he was learning to trust the data of his own heart. I was still the quiet observer, but I was learning to be an active participant in my own life, to step out from behind the lens and into the frame. There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, and then there are the moments that follow, the quiet, deliberate choices you make every day to honor that initial, transformative instant. The choice to leave a door open, the choice to bridge the distance on a sofa, the choice to ask a terrifying question, the choice to say yes. Our love wasn't built in one cataclysmic event. It was built in the thousand small, honest moments that came after. It was built in the beautiful, comfortable silence we had learned, finally, to create together, a silence that was no longer about what was unsaid, but about what no longer needed to be said at all. We had found our way home, not to a place on a map, but to each other.